Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the past couple of lectures, I've talked about the book Al-Kafi and its compiler. I gave you a sense of the importance of the study of ahadith, of traditions of the Ahlul Bayt. And I also talked about the history of how those ahadith have come to us. Now, in the last lecture, there are a couple of things I want to actually add on to the last lecture, kind of the tail end of that descending tree coming from the Prophet down to someone like Shaykh al-Kulaini, where these ahadith are being passed from generation to generation. Like I mentioned, now I've described that process of how things have come down to someone like al-Kulaini. What has made it stick from that time until now? One of the things is that if you imagine the way people were at the time of the Prophet, what their intellectual level was like, what their culture of studying and learning was like, it was almost lacking, right? At the time of the Prophet, there was no writing as a way of recording knowledge. Everything was recorded through memory, through oral tradition, and these sorts of things. But as time progresses, writing becomes more important. Right, this is one of the cultural revolutions that Islam brought about to encourage writing, to make writing a way of preserving things for posterity. So by the time of someone like Shaykh al-Kulaini, there was a culture, a very strong culture of books, of writing and disseminating books, of copying books and these sorts of things. And so once Kulaini compiles his book, then to preserve that book and spread it throughout the Muslim lands, and then to have it come down to us was a relatively easy task, right? So that's one of the critical things to realize in the history of the transmission of these traditions. I want to give you a sense of the logistical challenges that someone like Shaykh al-Kulaini faced. Right? Again, we take for granted our ease of access to knowledge now, especially now in a digital age when things are literally at our fingertips. It's really easy to take for granted how difficult it was for someone like al-Kulaini to do what he did. So I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of that, a little bit of a sense of that by pointing out a couple of things. One of the challenges they had, of course, was that there's no printing at the time. Right now we take printing again for granted. At that time, everything's handwritten, right? And you think of the difficulty of reading handwritten texts. I actually have a couple of images I want to show you to give you a sense of that difficulty. This first text that I'm showing you, and even the second text, they're actually grammar books that I have. But these are handwritten grammar texts that have been copied and then put into book form, kind of offset editions of it. And you can just see the complex, how complex it would be to read this. You have the text itself within the central square or central rectangle, but then you see there are footnotes that are kind of starting with the text and trailing off into the margins. The margins are written this way and that, sometimes upside down in various shapes. And you have multiple commentaries on the main text that's in that central rectangle. And you can see the furthest on the first image, the last kind of commentary on the very end is my own, right? So it's this long tradition of recording these things in this complex way. So imagine studying traditions, studying various books in this kind of a form. How incredibly difficult it would be to do that. The third image is a copy of Al-Kafi. And apparently this was a copy that was read before Allama Majlisi, who's one of our great traditionists of about the 17th century. The fourth image is also a copy of Al-Kafi. And in the margins, it's the handwriting of Mullah Salih al-Mazandani, who's one of the commentators on Al-Kafi. And then the next image you see kind of the modern age beginning. So we had a person by the name of Ali Akbar Ghaffari, an Irani scholar, not a Hawza trained scholar, but an academic scholar who provided a great service to all of us by transferring those old texts that were handwritten into typeset. So Al-Kafi was one of the works that he produced almost half a century ago. And so this is an example of it's not exactly his edition of it, but it's taken from his edition. So it's very similar. So you can see things are now organized. You have a hadith separated by numbers, headings to kind of separate different sections. So it's much easier to find things, much easier to see where one thing starts and one thing ends. Moving on, just to, another image is there. This is actually Allama Majlisi's handwriting, his own handwriting. This is a commentary that he wrote known as Mir'atul Uqul. It's a commentary on Kitab Al-Kafi. That's his handwriting. Again, you can see it's beautiful, but it's also very difficult to read. And then you see the next image is actually a typeset version of that same commentary that Ali Akbar Ghaffari was able to do. So he went from that type, the handwriting to typeset, and you can see even if you don't know Arabic, you can see it's much better organized. You can see paragraphs and things highlighted and or underlined to make it clear where the text is and where the commentary is. And then just to continue all the way to the modern age, we have a couple of editions of Al-Kafi that came out before ITI's version. This first one, there's a picture of the cover, and then a picture of the text. And you can see translations into English of Al-Kafi that have happened. The next image is a cover of the translation of Al-Kafi done by Shaykh Sarwar. And then also the text of his commentary with both Arabic and English translation. And then the last two images are of ITI's Al-Kafi. We have the cover there, and then just one sample page of the text inside. You can see the Arabic and the English, and then commentary written at the bottom of the page. So just to give you a sense of the evolution of all of this, from those very difficult times, imagine what those scholars like Al-Kulaini were facing, and think of how easy it is now to flip open a book. Our Al-Kafi is even available on EPUB versions and stuff. It's downloadable. You can have it in seconds. Transfer it between devices. You can highlight things. It's so easy now compared to what they had to do in those days. When you have handwriting instead of printing, it certainly slows down the transfer of knowledge. It also introduces the possibility of omission, of transposition of words, and these sorts of things. Right. So those kinds of challenges are there. Imagine if you're trying to collect books from various places, you have to account for all the different errors that occur when someone hand writes something, and so that's an added challenge that someone like Kulaini would face. Sources were also spread out. I gave you an indication when I gave you talked about the biography of Shaykh Kulaini that everything wasn't like you couldn't even just go to a library and access everything at one go. That's another thing we take for granted. We have library access and different online bookstores and in-store bookstores where you can just it's a one-stop shop. That certainly wasn't the case. You had to travel extensively. Sometimes just to collect a tradition or a couple of traditions, you have to travel to a far-off city. And that to travel in those days compared to travel nowadays, there's no comparison. Facing the length of traveling on the back of animals, with bandits on the road and all sorts of different things that a person would face, right? That was an incredible hardship they had to face. And to top it all off, there's political persecution. If you remember, Shaykh Kulaini is living during the time of the minor occultation. And this is the time when the Abbasids are in power, and they are ruling with an iron hand. They know, they've heard the rumors, they know the prophecies about a Mahdi coming about, and they're very wary about anyone who is associated with this line of 12 Imams and with anyone who even claims to be a Mahdi, for fear of revolution and insurgency. So dealing with all of that is going to add to the difficulties of scholarship. So that's one issue I wanted to talk about, just to again give you a perspective on the hardships that those scholars faced. Another issue that I wanted to mention is actually to address a doubt that I can imagine would come out for you. And that is, if you listen to what I was saying about how things were passed down to us, how knowledge was disseminated, you might wonder, why didn't the Prophet just go ahead and write down everything himself, or dictate everything to Imam Ali Islam, have him write it down into a big, huge book, and then pass that down, instead of this process of trying to find students, teaching them something, not being satisfied, teaching it to the Imam, and so forth, generation after generation, going through this process of gradually disseminating knowledge. Why do all of that when it causes so many problems? You have those hypocrites, you have those people who misunderstand things, who hear something and don't hear something, right? Why face all of that? Why not simply write the encyclopedia like Al-Kafi yourself and have it there forever, right beside the Quran for people to follow until the Day of Judgment? The answer I want to offer is that the Imams, think about the purpose that the Imams and the Prophet himself were trying to accomplish. Their goal was not simply to put a book out there. Right? A book is not sufficient guidance for us. If that were the case, then the Quran would be sufficient. What we need, in addition to knowledge, is also an example, a living example, and we also need that process of educating ourselves and becoming kind of sufficient in our or maybe I'll use the word confident, to become confident in ourselves, in our abilities to learn and to teach and to implement on our own. So the Imams from the beginning, the Prophet himself and the Imams, they knew that eventually there would be this occultation. There would be a time when there would no longer be easy access or even any access to an infallible guide. And so gradually over the generations, they were preparing people by, in a way, weaning them off of a need for them, and at the same time transferring more and more of that knowledge to them, to the scholars. Right? So you think of like an inverse sort of relationship where the Imams are gradually moving into the background as they increase the role of the scholars, who are their students, in carrying the affairs of the ummah, so that when the occultation eventually happens, there'll be a group of people, kind of a whole class of people who will be able to assume the responsibilities of guiding, answering questions, and managing the affairs of the community. And this required this relationship over time. Just imagine, like, if the Imam simply spoon-fed things to people, the scholars would never feel like they could stand on their own 2 feet. Every little thing that came up, they would feel like they have to reach out to the Imam and say, all right, here's a question, what's the answer for it? Instead of that, the Imams give them what they need, they give them principles, and they train them on how to deal with situations, and then they send them off to far-reaching lands, or outlying lands, and they allow them to do what they need to do. If they have specific questions that haven't been addressed previously, then of course they would send questions to the Imam, or come at the time of Hajj and ask the Imam those particular questions. But in large part, these people had achieved a level of sufficiency where they could stand on their own 2 feet. The next topic I want to broach is the topic of problems that exist in the study of traditions. Right? Because I've talked to you about the importance of studying traditions. I've given you a sense of how they've come to us. I've also kind of hinted at in some discussions that there are different challenges to studying ahadith and understanding ahadith. And it's important to understand what these challenges are, because sometimes the challenges seem so great to people that they feel like it's not worth trying. That this is a lost cause, that traditions are too problematic, ahadith are too problematic, so we just cast them aside and stick to the Quran that we are confident in. And it goes back to that same problem and the attitude of hasbuna kitabullah, that somehow one part of guidance is enough and it will suffice us of the other, when the Prophet himself has said that there are two parts of guidance and both are necessary. All right, so let's address what these at least some of these problems are. I'll offer some solutions, and hopefully I'll give you a sense that it's not a lost cause. There is a methodology. There is a way to kind of sort through all of this and come away with solid guidance in which we can be at least to some degree confident. I'm going to divide the problems that we deal with in traditions into 3 categories. There's some problems that come into play right at the source, So there are problems in certain circumstances in which the Prophet and the Imams found themselves, because of which they've had to introduce certain things, certain discrepancies and problems into the traditions. So they themselves are the cause of some of these problems, and I'll explain what that means shortly. The second part of the problems are problems that are associated with the transmitters. So the intermediaries between the infallible and us, they sometimes had problems or introduced the problems into the traditions. And then thirdly, we ourselves have some problems because of our distance from the time when the Imams were living and other things. We have a problem in understanding what they've said, even if what they said is perfectly clear. So there are three different parts. I'll address at least the first one in this lecture. So one of the problems that came from the very source was that Islam was given to us in a piecemeal fashion. And I've described this in various terms in past lectures. The Quran was revealed in piecemeal fashion. Also the Hadith were given to us in piecemeal fashion. There's one tradition I'll share with you which shows this gradual nature of things being taught to us and how that introduces a problem. Imam as-Sadiq says, "Do you not know that a man would come to the Messenger of God and ask him about an issue, and he would provide him its answer? Then after that, information would come to the Messenger that abrogated that answer. For some traditions did in fact abrogate others." All right, so this goes back to that issue I was talking about, how the Prophet was being told to do things over time. Sometimes he would have to change past commands or past prohibitions and reverse his ruling. And it was all within Allah's plan. He had intended for all of this to happen, but people didn't always know that. And so someone would come along, they would hear something from the Prophet, not realizing that a year later, several months later, it was abrogated. So he's going off narrating one part of it without realizing that what he has now is no longer valid. It's expired knowledge. And so that, of course, introduces a discrepancy into the knowledge that we have. And the discrepancy is because of the way that source was given to us. The tradition I shared with you earlier from Imam Ali alayhi salam, when he was talking to Sulaym ibn Qais, that also addresses the same problem. If you remember, he said, "They have come to you through a third type who heard the Messenger of God command something, after which he forbade it unbeknownst to him. And you heard him forbid something, after which he commanded it unbeknownst to him." So it causes that same sort of problem. The solution to these kinds of discrepancies is relatively easy from our vantage point, because now we have a bird's eye view of all the traditions. For someone on the ground living at the time of the Prophet or an Imam, it was a challenge because they have limited access to knowledge. All they know is what they know. They don't have access to all the traditions that have been passed down. We now are very fortunate in this way, that we have access to all those traditions collected, organized for us. So right next to each other, we can see a tradition that, for instance, commands something, and then we can see that in a later generation it's been abrogated, and so very easily we know what to do with it and how to deal with each of those traditions, how to put them together. So that's not such a problem for us now. Another problem, the second problem that occurred right at the source, was that the Prophet and the Imams would teach people sometimes different things based on the capacity of that individual. All right, let me share a tradition with you that shows this, and I'll explain what I mean. So there's a person by the name of Dhuray al-Muharibi. He says that I told Abu Abdullah Sadiq that God has commanded me in his book to do something, and I would love to do it. The Imam asks, "And what is it?" Dhuray replies, "It is the statement, ثُمَّ لْيَقْضُوا تَفَثَهُمْ وَلْيُوفُوا نُذُورَهُمْ." He quotes this verse from the Quran, which is speaking about the need to do to break out of the ihram after Hajj. And he says, I want to act on this verse, but I need to understand the verse from you so I can act on it. The Imam says, لِيَقْضُوا تَفَثَهُمْ means they must meet their Imam, and لِيُوفُوا نُذُورَهُمْ means they must perform the rites of Hajj. So the Imam kind of explains this verse in a way that's not compatible with it, or it's not in line with its apparent meaning. But he explains that this verse somehow refers to the right that a believer has with regards to the Imam himself. Another companion, Abdullah ibn Sinan, said, having heard this, I went to Abu Abdullah as-Sadiq and said, may I be your ransom? What is the meaning of God's statement? ثُمَّ لْيَقْضُوا تَفَثَهُمْ وَلْيُوفُوا نُذُورَهُم. So we heard from Dhuray that the Imam had said such a commentary on this particular verse, and he didn't believe, maybe he didn't believe it, or he wanted to hear it with his own ears. So he comes and asks the same question of the Imam. What is the meaning of this verse? The Imam replies, it means you must trim your mustache and clip your nails and other such things. So now the Imam all of a sudden goes back to the literal meaning of the verse and says, this is what it means. You have to break your ihram. I said, may I be your ransom? Dhuray al-Muharibi reported to me that you said, and he quotes the previous answer, that you told him a different answer. So then the Imam says, Dhuray is right, and what I have told you is right. The Quran has exoteric and esoteric levels, but who is able to bear what Dhuray can bear? And he says, both answers are right. I gave him an answer that's correct, I gave you an answer that's correct. But the answer that I gave you is a literal answer, a literal explanation of the verse. The meaning I gave to Dhuray was a deeper answer. That was according to his capacity, because he has a great capacity. You have a lesser capacity, I gave you what you could handle as well. So both answers are correct. So you can see imagine this happening in a different circumstance where a person doesn't realize that the Imam has given two different answers. He only hears one, someone else only hears one. When these two things are narrated to the second generation, they're going to think that they're two conflicting answers that are being attributed to the Imam, and there's going to be a conflict over what to do with these traditions until someone understands how they fit together. Again, the solution to these kinds of problems is minimal for us, because we have that bird's eye view. We can see all those traditions, varying answers that the Imams would give for the exact same question, and we can see, come up with solutions for what to do with it, because we have that bird's eye view. So again, that's not a very difficult challenge for us. A third problem that occurs at the source is the issue of taqiyya. Right, so the Imams in certain circumstances would practice taqiyya, and because of taqiyya, they would give incorrect answers to particular questions. So let me just explain briefly what taqiyya is and how this works into guidance, and how it muddies the water for us and makes it difficult for us to understand what the truth is. So taqiyya, if you think of it, it's usually translated as dissimulation, where you say something that's untrue for certain to satisfy certain interests. It might be that you're under threat, and so to evade threat, you end up you say something false to evade that threat. It's also, I think, a good translation or a good understanding of taqiyya would be tact. Right, the word tact. It's important for us to be tactful in how we deal with situations. So someone might ask something. If I answer him, completely and truthfully, it may not be appropriate. It may have negative consequences. So I might choose not to tell him something. I'm not lying necessarily, but I'm withholding something that isn't going to serve a greater purpose. So tact is also a good way to understand it. Let me share a couple of hadith with you where the Imams themselves are practicing taqiyya, and you can see again how that's going to make it difficult for us to understand these ahadith. So these are some examples of problems at the source, right? Problems that were created from the time of the Prophet and the Imams themselves. There are some other issues as well. I'll speak about taqiyya to some extent in the next episode, because that's also an important issue that creates a lot of confusion for us when we're looking at ahadith that sometimes are saying contradictory things. So I'll address that, and then some other issues in the second and third areas that I mentioned before. Until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.